In Sweetwater County, Texas, an aging rancher was about to face down a pack of leather-clad predators. A quiet evening at the Broken Spoke Roadhouse turned deadly when Rex Dalton and his gang, the Vultures, stormed in, looking to claim territory through fear and humiliation. Earl Thompson wasn't your typical rancher. For decades, he had been a Golden Gloves boxing champion, known for walking away from the spotlight to build a life of quiet strength and integrity. When the Vultures escalated their threats from stolen hats to trespass and intimidation, they had no idea they were picking a fight in the shadow of Chuck Norris. What began as arrogance would become a calculated ambush, as Chuck's quiet vigilance and Earl's unshakable resolve triggered a community uprising. What began as a bullying spectacle in a smoky roadhouse would transform into a county-wide stand against violence. Sweetwater would never be the same after the day arrogant bikers learned what it means to threaten a rancher whose neighbor is Chuck Norris. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The evening sun cast long shadows across Broken Spoke Roadhouse, turning the weathered wood siding into streaks of gold and amber. Inside, ceiling fans spun lazily, stirring the heavy air thick with cigarette smoke, cooking grease, and decades of spilled whiskey. Earl Thompson sat alone at his usual corner table, shoulders curved from years of hard labor, nursing a single glass of iced tea. His weathered Stetson rested on the table beside a plate of half-eaten meatloaf. The hat's brim darkened with sweat stains that told the story of countless Texas summers. Maria Lopez wiped down the bar counter, her dark eyes occasionally flicking toward Earl with the protective instinct she reserved for her regulars. "Need anything else, Earl?" she called across the room. Earl shook his head, offering a small smile that barely lifted the corners of his mouth. "Just the check when you get a minute, Maria." The roadhouse door swung open with a bang that made conversations pause. Afternoon light flooded in, silhouetting the figures that filled the doorway, broad-shouldered men in leather vests emblazoned with vulture insignias, chains jingling from their belts. Their leader stepped forward first, a tall man with a shaved head and a beard trimmed to a sharp point. A jagged scar ran from his left ear to the corner of his mouth, giving him a permanent half-smile that never reached his cold eyes. "Well, look what we found, boys," he announced, voice carrying over the suddenly hushed room. Genuine Texas roadkill. The men behind him, 4 bikers, with varying degrees of tattoos, leather, and sneer, laughed on cue. They moved through the roadhouse like they owned it, boots heavy on the wooden floor, hands slapping tabletops as they passed. Maria straightened behind the bar. "Rex Dalton," she said, voice flat. "Didn't expect to see you and your vultures this far south." "Just expanding our territory, sweetheart," Rex replied, flashing teeth too white against his weathered face. "Heard this little shithole was worth a visit." His eyes scanned the room, finally settling on Earl. Something predatory flickered in his gaze. "Well now, what have we here? Museum exhibit of the lonely cowboy?" Earl didn't look up. Just cut another piece of meatloaf with methodical precision. In the farthest corner of the roadhouse, a booth sat half in shadow. Its lone occupant was still enough to be almost invisible. A man in his 60s with neatly trimmed reddish-brown beard, gone mostly silver. He wore a simple button-up shirt and jeans, but something in his posture suggested a coiled readiness beneath the casual exterior. He watched the scene unfold over the rim of a coffee mug, his eyes never leaving Rex and his crew. "Hey, Grandpa," Rex called, striding toward Earl's table. "I'm talking to you." He slapped a hand on the table, rattling Earl's plate. "Don't they teach manners out here in cowpoke country?" Earl finally looked up, his blue eyes calm as a windless day. "Son," he said, voice unhurried, "I'm just trying to finish my dinner." Rex's crew had positioned themselves in a loose semicircle behind their leader, one of them younger than the rest, with sleeve tattoos and a patchy attempt at a beard snickered and pointed at Earl's hands. "Look at those mitts. Rex, bet he's been milking bulls his whole life." Laughter rippled through the group. A few Roadhouse regulars chuckled uneasily, while others stared into their drinks, uncomfortable with the brewing conflict. "You'd be better off with some moisturizer, old-timer," Rex said, leaning closer. "Wife not around to remind you to take care of yourself?" His hand shot out, snatching Earl's hat off the table. "Nice hat." "Civil War issue?" Earl's expression didn't change, but something hardened in his eyes, a brief flicker quickly controlled. "I'd appreciate you giving that back," he said, voice still measured but carrying a new weight. "Oh, he'd appreciate it," Rex mocked, twirling the hat on his finger. "Real fancy talker for a dirt farmer." "That's enough," Maria called from behind the bar, her hand disappearing beneath the counter where everyone knew she kept a Louisville Slugger. "You want drinks? Fine. You want trouble? Take it elsewhere." Rex turned toward her, hat still spinning on his finger. "You running security now, Maria? What's the matter, cowboy can't speak for himself?" "He shouldn't have to," came a quiet voice from the corner. Every head turned toward the shadowed booth. The man there hadn't raised his voice, but somehow it cut through the noise like a knife. He set down his coffee mug with deliberate care. The youngest biker squinted. "Who the hell is that?" An older Roadhouse patron nearby whispered something, and the young biker's eyes widened slightly. Rex stared at the corner booth, momentarily thrown off rhythm, before recovering his smirk. Well, another geriatric cowboy coming to the rescue? He turned his attention back to Earl, determined not to lose his audience. "Your hat's dustier than my grandma's attic, old man." He tossed the hat onto the floor and ground his boot heel into it. Earl stood, slowly. Not rushing, not threatening, just rising to his full height, which was considerable. His movements had the careful precision of a man who'd spent a lifetime controlling his strength. "I don't want trouble," Earl said. "But that hat belonged to my father." "Oh, Daddy's hat," Rex mocked, stepping closer until he was chest to chest with Earl. The biker was taller by a couple inches, broader through the shoulders. "What are you gonna do about it, Pops?" The man in the corner booth set down his coffee and stood. He didn't approach, just watched with an intensity that seemed to lower the temperature in the room. "Rex," one of the older bikers muttered, glancing nervously toward the corner. "Maybe we should—" "Shut up," Rex snapped, not breaking eye contact with Earl. "I'm educating the locals." He raised a finger, poking Earl hard in the chest. "Rule 1. Vultures eat what they want." Earl didn't flinch, didn't blink. "Son, I've buried enough hot-headed young men to know where this road leads. Why don't you pick up my hat? And we'll forget this happened." Something dangerous flashed in Rex's eyes. "You threatening me, old man?" "Not a threat," Earl replied. "Just experience talking." Rex's hand shot out, grabbing Earl's collar. "Experience this." "All right, that's it." Maria's voice cracked like a whip as she emerged from behind the bar, baseball bat in hand. "Out! All of you leather-wearing idiots! Out of my place now." Rex held his position a moment longer, then released Earl with a theatrical shove that barely moved the older man. He grinned, displaying those two white teeth again. "We're just getting acquainted with the local wildlife, Maria." He bent down, scooped up Earl's hat, and made a show of dusting it off before setting it on Earl's head at a mocking angle. "There you go, Gramps. No hard feelings." He backed away, eyes still locked on Earl. "We'll be seeing more of each other. Count on it." He turned to his crew. "Let's go, boys. Place smells like mothballs and failure anyway." The bikers swaggered toward the door, but Rex paused, turning back to look directly at the man in the corner booth. Something passed between them. Recognition, challenge, warning before Rex pushed through the door, his crew following in his wake. The roadhouse remained silent for a long moment after they left, conversations slowly resuming in cautious murmurs. Earl picked up his hat, carefully reshaping the brim where Rex's boot had crushed it. Maria approached, setting the bat on the table. "You all right, Earl?" Earl nodded, settling his hat back on the table. "Just fine, Maria. Nothing I haven't handled before. Those aren't your typical troublemakers," she warned. "Rex Dalton's got a reputation from here to Dallas. Used to fight cage matches till he got banned for nearly killing an opponent. World's full of men who mistake cruelty for strength," Earl replied, sitting back down to finish his meal as if nothing had happened. In the corner booth, the bearded man watched Earl for a long moment, something like respect flickering in his eyes. Then he laid a few bills on the table, stood, and walked toward the door with the quiet confidence of someone who never needed to hurry. As he passed Earl's table, he paused. "Good evening, neighbor," he said simply. Earl looked up, nodding once. "Evening, Chuck." The man Chuck Norris continued toward the door, his boot steps barely audible on the wooden floor. He stepped out into the fading Texas sunlight, where across the street, Rex and his vultures were mounting their motorcycles. Their eyes met across the distance. Rex's smirk faltered for just an instant before he gunned his engine, the roar drowning out whatever he shouted to his crew. They peeled away in a cloud of dust and exhaust, heading toward the sunset with the arrogant certainty that they'd left their mark. Chuck watched them go, his expression unchanging. Then he turned and walked toward his truck, the last rays of sunlight catching the silver in his beard as the day ended and the long shadows of evening stretched across the small Texas town like a warning of things to come. Morning broke over Earl Thompson's ranch with the unhurried pace of a place that had seen 10,000 such dawns. Mist clung to the pastures where Black Angus cattle grazed, their dark shapes like moving shadows against the gold-tinged grass. The ranch house itself, single-story, white clapboard with a tin roof gone, silver with age, sat nestled against a stand of live oaks that had sheltered 3 generations of Thompsons. Earl stood on the porch, coffee mug in hand, surveying his land with the practiced eye of a man who could read the health of his operation in a glance. 50 yards away, Jake Miller was already at work. A gangly 17-year-old whose enthusiasm made up for what he lacked in experience. The boy was repairing a section of fence, his movements quick but careful as he stretched new wire between posts. "Watch your tension there," Earl called, setting his empty mug on the porch rail. "Too tight and it'll snap come winter." Jake adjusted his grip, easing back slightly. "Like this, Mr. Thompson? That'll do." Earl stepped off the porch, his boots leaving prints in the dew-heavy grass as he crossed to where Jake worked. "Your daddy teach you fencing before he moved to Houston?" Jake shook his head, hammering a staple into the post to secure the wire. "No, sir. Said that's why he left tired of fixing things that just break again." Earl made a non-committal sound. Jake's father had been many things unreliable and restless, chief among them. But Earl kept those thoughts to himself. The boy had enough to sort through without Earl adding to the pile. "Nothing wrong with fixing what's broken," Earl said instead, taking a pair of wire cutters from his belt to snip the excess. "Shows character." Jake's face brightened at the praise. "I was thinking of riding into town after lunch, if that's okay. Promised Mom I'd pick up her prescription." "That's fine. Take the old Ford if you want. Keys are on the hook." Earl squinted toward the eastern pasture. "Just be back before." The distant rumble of engines cut him off. Both Earl and Jake turned toward the sound, watching as a cloud of dust rose from the approach road, a road that led only to the Thompson ranch. "You expecting visitors, Mr. Thompson?" Jake asked, hand shading his eyes. Earl's expression hardened as 5 motorcycles came into view, chrome flashing in the morning sun. "No," he said simply. "Go on up to the house, Jake." "But I can help." "House," Earl repeated, voice firm but not unkind. Now. Jake hesitated, then nodded, gathering his tools before jogging toward the ranch house. Earl remained where he was, thumbs hooked in his belt loops, face impassive as the motorcycles rolled to a stop 20 yards away. Rex Dalton cut his engine first, removing mirrored sunglasses to reveal eyes bloodshot from a night of drinking. His crew followed suit, forming a loose semicircle behind him. "Well, if it isn't the cowboy from last night," Rex called, dismounting with exaggerated care. "Thought I recognized the name Thompson on the mailbox." Earl said nothing, just stood his ground. "Nice spread you got here," Rex continued, making a show of looking around. "Little run down, but I guess that fits the owner." His crew chuckled on cue, spreading out slightly as they approached. "This is private property," Earl said, voice carrying across the space between them. "State your business or leave." Rex's grin widened. "Ooh, hear that, boys? Cowboy's giving orders now." He stepped closer, boots crunching on the gravel. "Our business? Just being neighborly. Thought we'd check out the local attractions." His eyes narrowed. "Though I gotta say, they're pretty disappointing so far." From the corner of his eye, Earl saw Jake watching from the porch, tension visible in the boy's stance. Beyond him, almost hidden by the stand of live oaks, another figure had appeared, Chuck Norris, leaning against a fence post at the edge of the neighboring property, his presence as unobtrusive as it was unmistakable. "Your cattle look scrawny," said the youngest biker, the one with the sleeve tattoos. He'd wandered toward the nearest paddock, poking a stick through the fence at a grazing heifer. The animal snorted and backed away, just like their owner. "Leave the livestock be," Earl said, an edge entering his voice. "Or what?" Rex challenged, stepping closer. "You gonna call the sheriff? I hear the county office is a 40-minute drive." He glanced toward the house, spotting Jake. "That your boy? Bit scrawny too. Needs some meat on those bones." Earl shifted, subtly placing himself between Rex and Jake's line of sight. "He works for me. And you're trespassing." "Trespassing," Rex repeated, rolling the word around like he was tasting it. Fancy word for a simple rancher. He reached the fence Jake had been repairing and casually kicked at a post, testing its stability. Not much of a fence builder either. The youngest biker had made his way to a metal feed barrel near the cattle pen. With a grin toward his companions, he shoved it hard, knocking it over. Feed spilled across the dirt as several nearby cattle startled, moving away in a confused group. "Hey!" Jake shouted from the porch, starting forward. "Jake, stay there," Earl called sharply, not taking his eyes off Rex. Rex's smile turned ugly. "Kid's got more fire than you, old-timer." He took another step forward, entering Earl's personal space. Maybe he should learn what happens when you try to stare down the wrong man. For the first time, Earl's calm exterior showed a crack, not fear, but something colder and harder. He straightened to his full height, shoulders squaring. "You've had your fun. Now get off my land before I forget my manners." Rex's eyes widened in mock surprise. "Is that a threat from Grandpa Cowboy?" He turned to his crew. "Did you hear that, boys? I think he's threatening us." The bikers laughed, moving closer to form a tighter circle around Earl. The youngest one picked up a piece of fence post, tossing it from hand to hand. 5 against 1 doesn't seem like fair odds," came a quiet voice from behind them. The bikers turned, finding Chuck Norris standing just inside the fence line. None of them had heard him approach. He stood relaxed, hands at his sides, wearing a simple flannel shirt and jeans that somehow didn't diminish the aura of contained power that surrounded him. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Who the hell invited you?" Rex demanded, though something in his voice had changed, a note of uncertainty creeping in. Neighbors look out for each other around here, Chuck replied, his tone conversational but his eyes hard as flint. Earl's fence marks his property line. Beyond that, he nodded toward the adjacent land. You'd be trespassing on mine. The older bikers exchanged glances. One of them leaned toward Rex, muttering something that made Rex's eyes narrow. I don't care who his neighbor is, Rex said loudly. Though his posture had changed subtly, weight shifted back, ready to move. We're just having a friendly chat with the cowboy here. Didn't sound friendly to me, Chuck observed, taking a single step forward. Just one step, but it seemed to shrink the space between them. Sounded like 5 men looking for trouble they aren't prepared to handle. The youngest biker snorted. What? You think we're scared of some old... He broke off as Rex's hand shot out, grabbing his arm in a vice-like grip. Shut up, Spike, Rex hissed. His eyes hadn't left Chuck, and something like recognition had dawned in them, a reassessment of the situation that left him suddenly less certain of his position. For a long moment, no one moved. The only sounds were the distant lowing of cattle and the whisper of wind through the live oaks. Then Rex forced his smirk back into place, though it didn't reach his eyes. We were just leaving anyway, he announced, backing toward his motorcycle. This place stinks of cow shit and wasted lives, he pointed at Earl. We'll finish our conversation another time, cowboy, when your babysitter isn't around. Chuck hadn't moved, hadn't changed expression, but something in his stillness seemed more threatening than any posturing. Rex mounted his bike, gunning the engine with unnecessary force. Let's go, boys. Place isn't worth our time. He wheeled his motorcycle around, spraying gravel, and roared down the approach road. His crew followed, the youngest Spike throwing one last glare over his shoulder before they disappeared in a cloud of dust. Earl watched them go, then turned to Chuck with a nod of acknowledgement. Appreciate the backup, but I had it handled. I know you did, Chuck replied simply, just being neighborly. Jake jogged over from the porch, eyes wide. Mr. Norris, sir, that was, He struggled to contain his excitement. They ran off like scared rabbits. The corner of Chuck's mouth twitched in what might have been a smile. Men like that are all noise until they face someone who isn't intimidated by volume. He looked at Earl. You weren't intimidated. Takes more than leather and loud engines to scare me, Earl said, bending to right the overturned feed barrel. But they'll be back. Men like that can't let a challenge go. Chuck nodded, helping Earl scoop the spilled feed. Then we'll be ready. He glanced at Jake. All of us. Jake straightened, chest puffing slightly. Yes, sir. Earl brushed feed dust from his hands. Jake, finish securing that fence section, then take the truck and run your errands in town. As the boy hurried off, Earl turned back to Chuck. Those weren't just random troublemakers. The leader, Rex, he seemed to have some kind of purpose. I noticed, Chuck agreed. Keep your eyes open. I'll do the same. He looked toward the road where dust still hung in the air. Some men measure themselves by how much fear they can create in others, when they find someone who isn't afraid. He left the thought unfinished. Earl nodded, understanding the unspoken warning. I'll keep Jake close. Good. Chuck turned to go, then paused. I'll be at the roadhouse tonight. Might be worth stopping by. Maria's meatloaf night, Earl said with the ghost of a smile. Wouldn't miss it. As Chuck walked back toward his own property, Earl watched him go, thinking about their conversation. He glanced toward Jake, working diligently at the fence, then toward the road where the bikers had disappeared. Something was brewing. He could feel it in his bones, the way he could feel a storm coming days before the clouds appeared. He looked down at his hands, weathered and calloused from decades of honest work. There had been a time when those hands had been wrapped in boxing gloves, when he'd been the golden boy of the county circuit. But he'd walked away from that life, choosing peace over glory. Now trouble had found him anyway, as it sometimes did for men who knew how to stand their ground. Earl sighed, turning back toward the fence line. Whatever was coming, he'd face it as he'd faced everything else in his 63 years, with quiet strength and the determination of a man who had nothing to prove, but everything to protect. The Broken Spoke Roadhouse glowed like a lantern in the gathering dusk. Neon beer signs casting blue and red shadows across the gravel parking lot. Inside, the Friday night crowd had swelled beyond the usual regulars' ranch hands from neighboring properties, truckers passing through, and locals looking for cold beer and hot food after a long week. Maria moved behind the bar with practiced efficiency, pulling draft beers and mixing simple drinks while keeping one eye on the rowdier patrons. The jukebox in the corner played Waylon Jennings, barely audible above the hum of conversation and occasional bursts of laughter. In the back, Chuck Norris occupied the same corner booth as the night before, nursing a cup of black coffee. His presence had generated a subtle ripple when he'd first entered, nodding acknowledgments, respectful distance, whispered explanations to those who didn't recognize him. Now he sat in relative peace, watching the door with patient attention. Jake Miller burst in first, holding the door for Earl, who followed at a more measured pace. The boy's eyes scanned the room eagerly until they found Chuck, his face lighting up with barely contained excitement. Earl placed a hand on Jake's shoulder, steering him toward the bar where Maria waited. "Evening, Maria," Earl said, removing his hat. "Got room for two more? For you?" "Always." Maria smiled, already pulling a glass of iced tea for Earl and a soda for Jake. "Meatloaf's still hot if you're hungry." "Sounds perfect." Earl glanced around the crowded roadhouse. "Busy night. Word travels fast in small towns," Maria replied, her voice lowered. "Especially word about city bikers causing trouble at the Thompson Ranch." She nodded toward several tables where local ranch hands sat, their attention periodically shifting to Earl. "Those boys came in asking if I'd seen you tonight. Think they're concerned." Earl sighed. "No need for concern, just a misunderstanding." Jake couldn't contain himself any longer. Mr. Norris stood up to them. "You should have seen it, Maria. He didn't even have to do anything, they just took off." Maria raised an eyebrow at Earl, who shook his head slightly. "Don't go making more of it than it was, Jake. Why don't you take a seat at the counter?" "I need to speak with Chuck for a minute." Jake looked disappointed but nodded, sliding onto a bar stool. "Yes, sir." Earl made his way through the crowd toward Chuck's booth, nodding to familiar faces as he passed. A few men reached out to touch his shoulder or offer quiet words of support. By the time he reached Chuck's table, the room had grown noticeably quieter, attention shifting toward the two men. "Mind if I join you?" Earl asked. Chuck gestured to the seat across from him. "Been expecting you." Earl settled into the booth, placing his hat on the table between them. "Seems I've become the talk of the town." "Small towns run on talk," Chuck replied, sipping his coffee. "Gives people something to do between cattle auctions." A ghost of a smile crossed Earl's weathered face. "True enough." He glanced around at the watching faces before lowering his voice. "This isn't their fight, Chuck. I don't want anyone getting hurt over some hot-headed bikers with too much time on their hands." "It became their fight when Rex and his crew rolled into town," Chuck said quietly. "Men like that don't stop at one target. They're looking to establish territory, show dominance. You were just first in line." Earl considered this, absently tracing a knot in the wooden tabletop. "Maybe. But I can handle my own troubles." "I know you can," Chuck said, meeting Earl's gaze directly. "Golden Gloves champion, 3 years running, if I remember correctly. Turned down a professional career to come back and run your father's ranch." Surprise flickered across Earl's face. That was a lifetime ago. How did you— I pay attention, Chuck replied simply. Just like I've been paying attention to Rex Dalton and his vultures. They've been running a protection racket up north, moving into small towns, causing trouble, then offering security for a price. Earl's expression hardened. That won't fly here. No, Chuck agreed. It won't. The roadhouse door banged open, and the background music seemed to fade as Rex Dalton strode in, flanked by his entire crew. They'd added to their numbers since morning now, 7 men strong, all in leather vests with the vulture insignia. Rex paused just inside the entrance, scanning the room until his eyes locked on Earl. A slow, predatory smile spread across his face. "Well, look at that," he announced loudly. "The whole town turned out to welcome us." He spread his arms theatrically. "I'm touched. Really." The roadhouse had gone silent, tension thick enough to cut. Maria moved from behind the bar, positioning herself where she could reach her baseball bat if needed. Jake half rose from his stool before Earl caught his eye with a warning glance. Rex sauntered toward the center of the room, his crew spreading out behind him like a hunting pack. "You know, we rode into this dusty little nowhere thinking it would be just another stop, but I'm starting to think there's potential here." His eyes swept the room. Good people. Hard workers just needing the right kind of protection. A ranch hand at a nearby table, Hank Wilson from the double bar, stood up, his chair scraping loudly. "We take care of our own in Sweetwater County." Rex's smile didn't waver. "Do you now? That's admirable. But times are changing, friend. World's getting more dangerous by the day." He turned in a slow circle, addressing the entire room. "My boys and we're professionals. We know how to keep trouble away from good folks like yourselves." "By causing it first?" someone called from the back. Laughter rippled through the crowd, quickly silenced by Rex's cold stare. He zeroed in on the speaker, a weather-beaten rancher in his 50s. "What was that?" The man held his ground. "Said you seem to be the trouble that needs keeping away." Rex's expression darkened. He started toward the man, only to find his path blocked as several ranch hands stood, forming a barrier of solidarity. Rex paused, reassessing, before his smile returned colder now. "Calculated. Seems like the locals have some fight in them, boys," he called to his crew. "I like that. Makes things interesting." His gaze drifted to Earl's table, finally acknowledging Chuck's presence. "And look who's here, the neighbor. Didn't get a proper introduction this morning." Chuck met his stare evenly, but said nothing. Rex turned back to Earl. "Your bodyguard doesn't talk much, does he?" "Man only needs to talk when he has something worth saying," Earl replied. "Otherwise, silence works just fine." A muscle twitched in Rex's jaw. He stepped closer to Earl's table, looming over it. "You think you're clever, old man. But I'm just getting started with you and this backward little town." Earl remained seated, seemingly unaffected by Rex's posturing. "Son, whatever you're selling, we're not buying. Why don't you take your boys and find somewhere else to play tough guy?" Rex's hand shot out, grabbing Earl's shirt front and hauling him halfway across the table. "You don't tell me where to go, cowboy. I decide when I'm done with you." The roadhouse erupted. Chairs scraped back as men stood. Maria shouted a warning. Jake lunged forward from the bar, only to be caught by a neighboring rancher who held him back. Through it all, Chuck hadn't moved, hadn't even set down his coffee cup. But something had changed in his posture. A subtle shift from relaxed observation to coiled readiness. His eyes, now fixed on Rex's hand gripping Earl's shirt, had gone hard as stone. "Let him go," Chuck said quietly, but his voice cut through the chaos like a blade. Rex glanced at Chuck, then back at Earl, conflict playing across his face. He wanted to escalate, to assert dominance, but something in Chuck's steady gaze made him hesitate. After a tense moment, he released Earl with a contemptuous shove. "Sure thing," Rex said, forcing a laugh. "Just having a friendly chat, right, Earl?" He backed away a step, then raised his voice to address the room again. "I came here tonight to make you all a proposition. This town needs protection, real protection. My boys and I can provide that. For a reasonable fee." Murmurs of disbelief and anger rippled through the crowd. "In return," Rex continued, undeterred, "we guarantee no trouble will come to your businesses, your ranches, your families." His smile turned predatory. "Of course, we can't be responsible for what happens to those who decline our services." "That sounds an awful lot like a threat, son," Earl said, straightening his shirt. "Just business," Rex replied. "The strong protect the weak. That's how the world works." Earl stood slowly, drawing himself up to his full height. The room quieted again. All eyes on the rancher, who suddenly seemed to fill more space than his lean frame should allow. "I've lived in this county for 63 years, Earl said, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. "Built this ranch with my own 2 hands after my father passed. Buried my wife here. Weathered droughts and floods and everything in between." His eyes locked with Rex's. "In all that time, I never once needed a man like you to protect me from anything." He stepped around the table, standing toe-to-toe with Rex. "And neither does anyone else in this room." Rex's face flushed with anger. But before he could respond, Chuck stood as well, moving to Earl's side with unhurried deliberation. He didn't speak, didn't make any threatening gesture, just stood there. A quiet presence that somehow changed the entire dynamic of the confrontation. Rex glanced between them, then at the roomful of locals who had begun to close ranks. For the first time, uncertainty flashed across his face. "You're making a mistake," he said, voice dropping to a dangerous register. "All of you. Only mistake was thinking you could come in here and push these people around," Earl replied. Rex's hand twitched toward his belt, where a knife handle protruded from a leather sheath. The movement wasn't lost on Chuck, whose eyes narrowed fractionally. The tension in the room stretched to breaking point, then snapped as Maria's voice cut through. "That's enough!" She emerged from behind the bar, baseball bat in hand. "I want all of you leather-wearing troublemakers out of my place. Now." Rex hesitated, eyes darting around the room, calculating odds. His crew had closed ranks behind him, hands hovering near weapons. But they were outnumbered by the locals, who now stood in unified opposition. After a long moment, Rex's posture shifted. Arrogance replacing the brief flash of uncertainty. "This isn't over," he said, backing toward the door. "Not by a long shot." He jabbed a finger at Earl. "You and me, cowboy tomorrow at noon. Right here in front of God and everybody." His gaze slid to Chuck. "Just you and me. No interference from your watchdog or anyone else. You man enough for that?" The roadhouse had gone completely silent. All eyes turned to Earl, who stood motionless, his expression unreadable. "I'm done fighting for sport, son," Earl said finally. "Been that way for 40 years. Rex's smile turned vicious. "This isn't sport, old man. This is me teaching you what happens when you stand in my way." He looked around the room. "Unless you want me and my boys to pay personal visits to every ranch and business in this county, you'll be here. Noon sharp." Earl said nothing, his silence neither acceptance nor refusal. Rex backed toward the door, his crew moving with him in practiced formation. "Noon tomorrow," he repeated, "or the consequences are on your head." He paused at the threshold, eyes finding Jake, who still stood by the bar. "Starting with the boy." With that parting threat hanging in the air, Rex pushed through the door, his crew following behind. The rumble of motorcycles filled the night as they pulled away, the sound fading slowly into the distance. The roadhouse remained frozen for a long moment before conversation erupted, voices overlapping in concern and anger. Maria hurried to Earl's side, her face tight with worry. "You're not actually considering this, are you?" she demanded. Earl met her gaze steadily. "Don't see that I have much choice, Maria." "There's always a choice," she insisted. "We can call the sheriff. Sheriff's office is understaffed and 40 minutes away," Earl replied. By the time they got here, the damage would be done. He looked around at the concerned faces surrounding him. "This isn't your fight. It's mine." "Like hell it is," said Hank Wilson, stepping forward. "Those thugs threatened the whole county. We stand together." Murmurs of agreement rose from the crowd. Earl shook his head, the weight of responsibility visible in the set of his shoulders. "I appreciate that, Hank. All of you. But a crowd just gives Rex what he wants: an audience. A chance to make an example." He picked up his hat, settling it carefully on his head. "Some things a man has to handle himself." "Not this time," Chuck said quietly. When Earl turned to him, Chuck continued, "This isn't about one man's pride, Earl. It's about drawing a line." Jake pushed forward, his young face flushed with emotion. "Mr. Thompson, you can't." "Jake," Earl cut him off gently. "Go wait in the truck. We're heading home." The boy looked ready to argue but subsided under Earl's steady gaze. With a last worried glance at the room, he trudged reluctantly toward the door. Earl turned back to Chuck. "I need to get that boy home, but we should talk tomorrow morning." Chuck nodded, once. "I'll stop by at dawn." As Earl moved toward the door, the crowd parted for him, hands reaching out in silent support. Maria caught his arm at the threshold. "Earl Thompson, don't you dare face that man alone tomorrow," she said, fiercely. Earl covered her hand with his own. "Some storms you can't outrun, Maria. You just have to weather them." With a gentle squeeze, he released her hand and stepped into the night. Behind him, the roadhouse hummed with worried conversation. Chuck remained standing in the center of the room, his quiet presence a counterpoint to the anxious energy surrounding him. Maria made her way back to him, concern etched on her face. "He's going to get himself killed," she said bluntly. Chuck's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Determination, perhaps, or certainty. He said simply. The night stretched long and sleepless across the Thompson ranch. In the small bedroom that had once belonged to his parents, Earl sat on the edge of his bed, a battered wooden box open before him. Inside lay the remnants of another life, faded newspaper clippings, a pair of worn leather boxing gloves, a tarnished medal on a frayed ribbon. His fingers brushed over them gently, stirring memories that had lain dormant for decades. A soft knock at the door pulled him from his reverie. "Mr. Thompson?" Jake's voice came through the wood. "You still awake?" Earl closed the box, sliding it under the bed before answering. "Come in, Jake." The door creaked open, revealing Jake in flannel pajama pants and a faded t-shirt, his hair mussed and eyes troubled. "Couldn't sleep," he admitted, hovering in the doorway. "Me neither." Earl gestured to the old rocking chair in the corner. "Sit if you want." Jake settled into the chair, its wooden frame protesting slightly. For a long moment, neither spoke, the silence broken only by the distant cry of a coyote and the gentle creak of the house settling around them. "Are you really going to fight that man tomorrow?" Jake finally asked, his voice small in the darkness. Earl sighed, running a hand through his silver hair. "Been asking myself the same question all night." "You could beat him," Jake said with the fierce certainty of youth. "I've seen you split logs that would break most men's arms. You're stronger than you look." A ghost of a smile touched Earl's lips. Strength isn't always about muscle, Jake. Then what is it about? Earl considered the question, looking past Jake to the window where stars hung like distant lanterns in the Texas sky. Knowing when to use it, he said finally. And when not to. Jake's brow furrowed. But those men, they're threatening everyone. You, me, the whole county. Someone has to stand up to them. Standing up doesn't always mean throwing punches. Earl leaned forward, elbows on his knees. My daddy taught me to box when I was younger than you. Said every man should know how to defend himself. His voice took on a distant quality, remembering. I got pretty good at it. Won competitions. Had offers to go professional. Why didn't you? Jake asked, leaning forward. Met my Eleanor, Earl said simply. She saw something in me I didn't see myself, something more than just a pair of fists. He glanced toward the bedside table, where a photograph of a smiling woman with kind eyes stood in a simple frame. After we married, I put the gloves away, decided to build something instead of just being good at tearing things down. Jake absorbed this in silence, glancing around the room that bore the subtle imprint of a woman's touch, even years after her passing, the quilted bedspread, the pressed flower in a frame on the wall, the careful arrangement of the few ornaments on the dresser. So you won't fight? He asked finally. Earl's weathered face showed the conflict within. There's fighting, and then there's standing your ground. Two different things. He looked directly at Jake. A man throwing punches just to prove he can, that's not strength. That's fear wearing a mask. What about Mr. Norris? Jake asked. He seems like he knows how to fight. Chuck? Earl nodded slowly. He does. Better than most. But have you ever seen him start a fight? Jake thought for a moment, then shook his head. Men who really know their power don't need to prove it to anyone. Earl stood, walking to the window to look out at his land, silvered by moonlight. Chuck learned that lesson a long time ago. Same one I learned. But Rex doesn't care about lessons, Jake protested. He just wants to hurt people, to scare them. That's because he's hollow inside, Earl said, turning back to face Jake. Men like that, they make noise because they're empty. They hurt others because they're hurting. Doesn't excuse it, but explains it. Jake was quiet for a long moment, processing. So what will you do tomorrow? Earl's expression firmed. Decision crystallizing. I'll be there at noon, but I won't let Rex dictate the terms. He moved back to the bed, sitting beside the box he'd hidden. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is refuse to play someone else's game. Jake nodded slowly, then stood, moving toward the door. He paused with his hand on the knob. I want to be there too. Earl looked up sharply. No, you're staying here. But, not negotiable, Jake. This isn't your fight. It is, Jake insisted, a new resolution in his young face. You taught me that a community sticks together, that we look out for each other. I'm part of this community too. Earl studied the boy, no. The young man standing before him, seeing for the first time the strength that had been building there under his guidance. Not the brash confidence of youth, but something steadier, more grounded. It reminded him of himself at that age, before he'd learned the harder lessons life had to teach. After a long moment, Earl nodded once. We'll see, he said, which wasn't a yes, but wasn't a no either. Now get some sleep. Dawn comes early on a ranch. Jake hesitated, then crossed the room in 3 quick strides and wrapped Earl in an unexpected hug. Whatever happens, I'm proud to work for you, he said, his voice muffled against Earl's shoulder. Surprised, Earl returned the embrace awkwardly, one hand patting the boy's back. Go on now, he said gruffly when Jake pulled away. Got fences that need mending in the morning, regardless of what else happens. After Jake left, Earl sat for a long time in the quiet darkness. Eventually, he reached under the bed and pulled out the wooden box again. This time, he lifted the false bottom, revealing what lay beneath the mementos: a pair of hand wraps, still neatly rolled, and a small jar of liniment that smelled of camphor and memories. He wouldn't go looking for a fight tomorrow, but if one found him, he'd be ready. As the first hint of dawn touched the eastern sky, a truck rumbled up the approach road to the Thompson Ranch. Chuck Norris sat behind the wheel, his expression calm but alert, scanning the property as he pulled to a stop near the porch. The house door opened before he could knock, revealing Earl already dressed and waiting, a mug of coffee in his hand. "Right on time," Earl said, holding the door wider. "Coffee's hot." Chuck nodded, following Earl into the kitchen where a second mug waited on the table. He sat, wrapping his hands around the warm ceramic, studying his friend across the scarred wooden surface. "You've made up your mind," he observed. Earl nodded, taking the seat opposite. "I have. Want to tell me what you decided?" "I'm going to be there at noon," Earl said simply. "But I'm not going to give Rex what he wants." Chuck's eyes narrowed slightly. "Which is?" "A show," Earl replied. "He needs an audience, needs to make an example. That's how men like him operate, through fear and spectacle." He took a sip of his coffee. "I'm not going to play his game." "He won't give you a choice," Chuck warned. "There's always a choice," Earl said, echoing Maria's words from the night before. "Even if it's just choosing how you face what's coming." Chuck was silent for a moment, considering. "Rex isn't just a bully, Earl. He's dangerous. I made some calls last night. He did 3 years for aggravated assault before he started the Vultures. Nearly killed a man with his bare hands in a bar fight." Earl nodded, unsurprised. "I figured as much. There's a coldness in his eyes, seen it before in men who've crossed lines. Most won't. Which is why you shouldn't face him alone," Chuck said. "I won't be alone," Earl replied, meeting Chuck's gaze steadily. "Not with you there." The faintest smile touched Chuck's lips. "So you're accepting my help?" "Let's just say I'm acknowledging reality," Earl said dryly. "You'll be there, whether I want you to be or not." "True," Chuck conceded. He leaned forward slightly. "But we need a plan, Earl. Rex won't come alone, and he won't fight fair." "I know." Earl rose, moving to the window where the first golden light of day was spilling across his land. "Been thinking about that all night." He turned back to Chuck. "What do you suggest?" Chuck set down his mug, his expression turning focused. "First, we need to control the environment. The roadhouse is too enclosed, too many civilians in the crossfire." Earl nodded. "Maria's place shouldn't suffer from my trouble." "We need open ground, room to maneuver," Chuck continued. "Somewhere that doesn't give Rex's crew the advantage of numbers." "The old cattle auction grounds," Earl suggested. "Half a mile south of town. Been empty since they built the new pavilion. Plenty of space, no bystanders to get hurt." "Good," Chuck agreed. "Second, we need to split his attention. Right now, he's focused on you as the primary target. We need to change that calculus." "How?" Chuck's eyes held a glint that hadn't been there before, the look of a strategist piecing together a plan. "By making him realize he's not just dealing with one old rancher. He's facing a community that stands together." Earl frowned. "I don't want anyone else at risk." "They already are," Chuck pointed out gently. "Rex made that clear last night. This isn't just about you anymore. It's about whether this county belongs to the people who built it or the men who want to take it by force." The truth of those words settled heavily on Earl's shoulders. He returned to the table, sinking back into his chair. "So, what exactly are you proposing?" Before Chuck could answer, a noise from the hallway drew their attention. Jake stood in the doorway, fully dressed, despite the early hour, his face set in determined lines. "Morning," he said, trying to sound casual but unable to hide the nervous energy in his voice. "You're here early, Mr. Norris." Chuck nodded to the boy. "Jake." Earl sighed. "How long have you been listening?" Jake had the grace to look slightly abashed. "Not long, just heard something about the auction grounds." He straightened, squaring his shoulders. "If you're planning something for today, I want to help." Earl opened his mouth to refuse, but Chuck spoke first. "Good," he said, surprising both Earl and Jake. "We could use another set of hands." "Chuck," Earl began, a warning in his voice. "He's part of this community too," Chuck said quietly, echoing Jake's words from the night before. "And he's not a child anymore, Earl. He deserves the chance to stand up for what matters to him." Earl looked between them, Chuck's steady certainty, Jake's barely contained eagerness, and recognized the futility of arguing. "Fine," he relented. "But you follow instructions exactly. No heroics." Jake nodded quickly. "Whatever you need." "Sit," Earl said, gesturing to the empty chair. "We're just getting started." As Jake pulled up a seat, the rising sun cast long shadows across the kitchen table, where the three men, one in his twilight years, one in his prime, one just beginning his journey, bent their heads together, voices low as they laid plans for the confrontation to come. Outside, the ranch came alive with morning sounds, cattle lowing in the distance, birds calling from the live oaks, wind rustling through the tall grass. It was the ordinary music of a Texas dawn, unchanged for generations. But today it carried a different note, an undercurrent of anticipation, as if the land itself was holding its breath, waiting to see which way the wind would blow when noon finally arrived. The sun climbed toward its zenith, harsh and unforgiving in a cloudless Texas sky. Heat shimmered above the cracked concrete of the abandoned auction grounds, the empty pens and loading chutes standing like the bleached bones of a forgotten era. A single water tower rose above the complex, its faded lettering still proclaiming Sweetwater County Livestock in peeling paint. Word had spread through the county with the efficiency that only small towns can manage. By 11:30, vehicles lined the perimeter of the grounds, pickup trucks, dusty sedans, even a few tractors. Their occupants maintained a respectful distance, gathering in small clusters, voices hushed as they waited. Not just spectators, but witnesses, people who understood that what happened here today would determine the future of their community. Maria's truck pulled in at 11:45, parking alongside Hank Wilson's battered Ford. She stepped out, scanning the grounds with worried eyes, a shotgun visible through the rear window of her cab. "Any sign of Earl?" she asked as Hank approached. Hank shook his head, pushing back his hat. "Not yet. Chuck neither." He nodded toward the growing crowd. "But half the county's here. Rex?" "Nothing so far." Hank's weathered face creased with concern. "You think Earl will really show?" "Earl Thompson is many things," Maria replied. "But he's never been a man to break his word." At 5 minutes to noon, the distinctive rumble of motorcycles broke the tense quiet. Heads turned as a cloud of dust appeared on the horizon, growing larger as it approached. Rex led the pack, sunglasses reflecting the harsh sunlight, leather vest open over a bare chest covered in tattoos. Behind him rode at least a dozen men more than had been at the roadhouse the night before. The vultures had called in reinforcements. They roared into the auction grounds in formation, engines revving aggressively before cutting out in near unison. Rex dismounted first, scanning the crowd with a predatory smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Quite the turnout," he called, voice carrying across the open space. "Y'all that eager to see an old man get what's coming to him?" He checked his watch with theatrical flourish. "But where is our cowboy?" "Clock's ticking," Murmurs ran through the assembled locals. Eyes darted toward the road, searching for any sign of Earl or Chuck. The minute hand on the auction house clock ticked closer to noon. "Maybe he ain't comin'," one of the bikers suggested, loud enough to be heard. "Old man probably pissed himself and ran." Rex's smile widened. "Then we'll just have to pay him a house call. Him and everyone else who thought they could stand against us." He turned in a slow circle, addressing the crowd. "Consider this your object lesson, folks. This is what happens when the sound of an approaching vehicle cut him off." All eyes turned to see a cloud of dust rising from the eastern road, not from town, but from the direction of the Thompson and Norris ranches. As it drew closer, they could make out Earl's old blue pickup truck, moving at a deliberate pace. The truck pulled into the auction grounds and came to a stop 30 yards from where Rex and his crew waited. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the driver's door opened, and Earl Thompson stepped out alone. He wore simple work clothes, faded jeans, a blue chambray shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows, and his weathered Stetson. No weapons were visible as he closed the truck door and stood beside it, calm and unhurried, his eyes finding Rex across the distance. Rex's smile faltered slightly at Earl's composure. He'd expected fear, hesitation, not this quiet confidence. Recovering quickly, he spread his arms wide. "The man of the hour finally arrives," he called. "Though you're cutting it close, cowboy." Earl said nothing, just stood his ground, watching. Rex's expression hardened at the lack of response. "No bodyguard today? Where's your neighbor too scared to show his face?" Still, Earl remained silent, his stillness a counterpoint to Rex's theatrical posturing. Irritation flashed across Rex's face. "Nothing to say? That's fine. Your face will do plenty of talking once I'm done with it." He glanced at his crew, who had spread out in a loose semicircle behind him. "Though, I gotta say, I'm disappointed. Thought you'd at least bring backup." As if on cue, the passenger door of Earl's truck opened. Jake stepped out, moving to stand slightly behind Earl's right shoulder. A ripple of concern went through the watching crowd. The boy was clearly out of his depth against these hardened men. Rex laughed. "A kid? That's your reinforcement?" He shook his head in mock pity. "This is going to be even easier than I thought." Earl finally spoke, his voice carrying easily across the open space. "I came to tell you one thing, Rex Dalton. Just one thing, and then you can decide what happens next." Rex cocked his head, curiosity momentarily overriding his eagerness for confrontation. "This should be good. Go ahead, old man." Last words. Earl removed his hat, holding it against his chest as if addressing a funeral. "You picked the wrong town," he said simply. Rex's brow furrowed. "That's it? That's your big statement?" Earl nodded once, then set his hat back on his head with deliberate care. "That's it." Anger flashed across Rex's face. "Wrong town? Look around you, cowboy. Your neighbors are here to watch you fall. Your only backup is a skinny kid. Your tough guy neighbor is nowhere to be seen." He began walking forward, his crew moving with him. "I think I picked exactly the right town, one too weak to defend itself." Earl didn't move, didn't flinch as Rex approached. Jake shifted nervously beside him but held his ground. When Rex was 10 paces away, Earl spoke again, not to Rex, but to the air around them. "Now," he said quietly. For a split second, nothing happened. Then movement erupted from all sides of the auction grounds. From behind empty pens, from the shadow of the water tower, from the loading chutes and the auctioneer's booth, men and women emerged, moving with purpose. Not just the ranchers and farmhands who had been watching, but others who had arrived unseen while attention was focused on Earl. And they weren't alone. Chuck Norris appeared from behind the auction house, moving with the fluid grace of a man half his age. He wasn't alone either. Flanking him were a half-dozen ranch hands, each carrying coiled lariats, their expressions grim with determination. Rex faltered mid-stride, head swiveling as he took in the coordinated movement closing in around his crew. His confident sneer wavered, replaced by the first flickers of genuine concern. "What is this?" he demanded, backing up a step. Earl hadn't moved. "This," he said calmly, "is a community standing together." From atop the water tower, a metallic clang rang out. All eyes turned upward to see Hank Wilson standing on the maintenance platform, a wrench in his hand that he'd struck against the railing. Beside him, 2 more ranchers uncoiled long ropes. "You wanted an audience," Earl continued, his voice steady. "Well, now you've got one. But they're not here to watch. They're here to participate." Rex's face contorted with rage. "You think this changes anything? My boys will tear through these farmers like tissue paper." He turned to his crew. "Show them what happens to anyone who stands against the vultures." But his crew hesitated, looking at the closing circle of determined locals, at Chuck Norris's steady advance, at the men on the water tower. What had seemed like easy intimidation was rapidly transforming into a coordinated resistance. "Now!" Rex shouted, desperation creeping into his voice. 3 of the younger bikers moved forward, reaching for concealed weapons. Before they could draw, lassos whistled through the air from 3 directions. One caught a biker around the torso, pinning his arms. Another snared a boot, yanking the man off balance. The third settled around shoulders, pulling tight. More ropes flew, more bikers found themselves entangled. The locals moved with the practiced skill of people who had spent lifetimes handling cattle. Coordinated, efficient, working in pairs to subdue larger targets. Rex's head swiveled wildly, watching his advantage dissolve. "Fight back!" he screamed at his remaining crew. He reached into his vest, hand closing around a knife handle. "I wouldn't," came Chuck's voice, suddenly much closer than Rex had realized. He turned to find Chuck standing just 3 paces away, hands relaxed at his sides but eyes intensely focused. "Not unless you want to make this much worse for yourself." Rex's face twisted with rage and humiliation. With a guttural roar, he lunged at Chuck, knife flashing in the midday sun. Chuck moved like water, no wasted motion, no dramatic gestures. He simply wasn't where the knife expected him to be. His hand caught Rex's wrist, applying precise pressure to points that sent shockwaves of pain up the biker's arm. The knife clattered to the ground. Rex threw a wild left hook with his free hand. Chuck deflected it with a minimal movement, then delivered a single strike to Rex's sternum. Not hard enough to do lasting damage, but precisely calibrated to disrupt his breathing and balance. Rex staggered, gasping. Chuck released his wrist and stepped back, giving the man space to recover, to reconsider. Instead, blind fury overwhelmed Rex's judgment. He charged forward, throwing haymakers that telegraphed their intent before they were halfway thrown. Chuck evaded each with calm economy, letting Rex's own momentum work against him, redirecting rather than opposing force. When Rex finally overextended himself on a desperate lunge, Chuck ended it 3 lightning-fast strikes that found vulnerable points with surgical precision. Rex crashed to his knees, then toppled to the side, conscious but unable to coordinate his limbs. Around them, the last of the resistance had crumbled. Bikers sat subdued on the ground, some bound with rope, others simply yielding to the inevitable. The entire confrontation had lasted less than 5 minutes. Earl hadn't moved from his position by the truck. Now he stepped forward, stopping to stand over Rex. The biker looked up at him, hatred and disbelief warring in his eyes. "How?" Rex gasped, still struggling to catch his breath. "You're just a bunch of farmers. Ranchers," Earl corrected mildly. "And we've been handling creatures bigger and meaner than you our whole lives." He crouched down, meeting Rex at eye level. "Here's what's going to happen now," Sheriff's already on his way called him before we even got here. You and your boys are going to jail for assault, attempted extortion, and whatever else he can make stick. Rex's eyes darted around, looking for any avenue of escape. Finding none, he spat on the ground near Earl's boot. We'll be out in a day, and then we'll be back with more men. Earl shook his head. No. You won't. He nodded toward the crowd, where several people had phones raised, recording everything. Because every law enforcement agency in 3 counties is getting footage of this. Border Patrol, too. I'm betting at least some of your boys have warrants outstanding, and those who don't will after today. His eyes widened as he realized the trap he'd walked into. But more than that, Earl continued, his voice dropping so that only Rex could hear. You're going to stay away because deep down, you're a coward. You only pick fights you think you can win, and you know now that you can't win here. He stood, straightening to his full height. This community has been standing together against worse than you for generations. We'll be here long after you're forgotten. The sound of sirens cut through the tense air. 2 county sheriff's vehicles appeared on the horizon, dust trails rising behind them. Earl turned away from Rex, walking back to where Jake stood, watching with wide eyes. You did good, son, he said quietly, placing a hand on the boy's shoulder. Jake swallowed hard. I didn't do anything. You stood your ground, Earl replied. Sometimes, that's enough. Chuck approached them, his breathing as calm as if he'd just taken a casual stroll rather than subdued a violent aggressor. It worked, he said simply. Earl nodded. Community always was stronger than any individual, just needed reminding of it. He looked around at the ranchers and townsfolk, who were now securing the subdued bikers, preparing to hand them over to law enforcement. Everyone needed reminding. As the sheriff's cars pulled into the auction grounds, Maria made her way to Earl's side. You had this planned all along, she said, accusation mixing with admiration in her voice. Not all along, Earl admitted. But Chuck and I figured it out this morning. Rex wanted a spectacle, so we gave him one. Just not the kind he was expecting. Maria shook her head, but a smile tugged at the corners of her mouth. You're a crafty old fox, Earl Thompson. Just experienced, Earl replied, watching as deputies began loading handcuffed bikers into their vehicles. Some lessons you learn the hard way, so others don't have to. Chuck stood slightly apart, observing the scene with quiet satisfaction. When the sheriff approached, hand extended in gratitude, Chuck shook it briefly, then pointed toward Earl, redirecting the recognition to where he felt it belonged. As the excitement began to settle, the gravity of what they'd accomplished spread through the crowd. They had faced down a threat, not through individual heroics, but through coordination, planning, and the strength that comes from standing together. It was a lesson written into the DNA of small towns like theirs, but one that sometimes needed reinforcement. Earl watched as the sheriff's car containing Rex pulled away. The biker's face, a mask of impotent rage, pressed against the window. The threat wasn't permanently eliminated. There would always be men like Rex, looking to prey on what they perceived as weakness. But today, at least, they had shown that appearance and reality can be very different things. Jake stepped up beside him, a new confidence in his bearing. What now, Mr. Thompson? Earl settled his hat more firmly on his head, looking out across the auction grounds where neighbors were embracing, shaking hands, and beginning to disperse back to their daily lives. Now, Earl said, the ghost of a smile touching his weathered face. Now we go home and fix that section of fence we were working on yesterday. Cattle don't care about what happened here today. They still need tending. Jake nodded, understanding the deeper message beneath the practical words. Life would go on, as it always had in this corner of Texas. But it would go on with the renewed knowledge that they were stronger together than apart. a lesson that would serve them well in whatever challenges lay ahead. As they walked back to the truck, Chuck fell into step beside them, his presence as unobtrusive as it was reassuring. 3 generations of quiet strength, moving forward together under the vast Texas sky, where the sun had reached its peak and begun its slow descent toward another evening in a land that had seen countless dramas play out upon its dusty stage. 3 weeks later, the Broken Spoke Roadhouse hummed with Friday night energy. The jukebox played Johnny Cash. Conversations flowed as freely as the beer, and laughter punctuated the comfortable chaos of a community at ease with itself. What had happened at the auction grounds was already transforming from current events to local legend, details shifting with each retelling. Maria moved among the tables, pausing at Earl's corner, where Chuck Norris and Jake now joined him. Hank Wilson was mid-story, gesturing dramatically. And there I was, up on that water tower, watching Rex's face when he realized he'd walked into a trap, Hank boasted. I swear. The man turned white as a sheet. Pretty sure he was red with anger, not white with fear, Earl corrected mildly. Hank waved off the correction. Details. We showed those city bikers what happens when they mess with Sweetwater County. Maria set fresh drinks on the table. You boys planning to tell this story every Friday for the next year? Probably, Hank admitted without shame. Not every day you get to be part of something like that. Chuck, who had remained characteristically quiet, raised his coffee mug. To community, he said simply. They all lifted their glasses in response. To community. As conversation shifted to cattle prices and the upcoming county fair, Earl noticed Jake staring thoughtfully into his soda. Something on your mind, son? He asked quietly. Jake looked up, just thinking about what happened, how different it could have gone. Earl nodded. That's the thing about crossroads, you never really know which path would have led where. All you can do is choose the one that lets you sleep at night. I keep thinking about Rex, Jake admitted. The sheriff said he's facing 5 to 10 years. Actions have consequences, Earl said. He made his choices. I know. It's just. Jake struggled to articulate his thoughts. He seemed so sure of himself, so convinced he was strong, but in the end, he was just hollow, Earl finished. All that bluster was covering an empty space where real strength should have been. Jake nodded slowly. How do you know the difference? Between real strength and just pretending? Earl considered this, fingers tracing condensation on his glass. Real strength doesn't need an audience. It's there when no one's watching. It's in the quiet moments when doing the right thing is harder than doing the easy thing. Chuck spoke unexpectedly. It's not about never being afraid, he added, voice low but clear. It's about what you do with the fear, whether you let it control you or you control it. Jake looked between the 2 older men. I want to be strong like that, he said simply. Earl's eyes softened. You're already on your way, son. Standing your ground that day, that took real courage. A commotion at the door drew their attention as Deputy Carson entered. He made his way to their table. Evening, Deputy. Everything all right? Earl asked. Carson nodded. Just fine. Thought you might want to know Rex Dalton accepted a plea deal. 5 years minimum, no possibility of early parole. And his crew? Chuck asked. Most got lesser sentences, 18 months to 3 years. The interesting part is, once Rex was in custody, his loyal vultures couldn't turn on him fast enough. Turns out he'd been running weapons, trafficking, drug distribution, the works. Earl nodded, unsurprised. Built his empire on fear instead of respect. That kind of foundation always crumbles eventually. After the deputy left, Jake excused himself to help Maria. The boy had taken extra work at the roadhouse on weekends, saving for community college. Chuck watched him go. That's a good young man. He is, Earl agreed. got a solid head on his shoulders. Just needed someone to believe in him. He glanced at Chuck, kind of like others I've known. Chuck's eyes crinkled slightly, the closest he typically came to a smile. You ever miss it? The ring? The spotlight? Earl looked down at his hands, still strong but marked by decades of honest work, rather than thrown punches. Sometimes, he admitted. Not the fighting itself, but the clarity of it. Just you and another man, testing what you're made of. And yet you walked away. Had something better to walk toward, Earl replied, his gaze drifting to Eleanor's empty chair, kept at their table out of habit. She used to say that any fool can make a fist, but it takes a real man to open his hand. They fell into comfortable silence, two men who had discovered that true strength often lies in restraint rather than release. The door opened, admitting young ranch hands just off their shifts. The youngest approached with nervous determination. Mr. Thompson? Mr. Norris? Would you mind if we joined you? We'd be honored to hear about the auction grounds, from the source. Earl glanced at Chuck, who gave an almost imperceptible nod. Pull up some chairs, Earl said. But fair warning, Hank here tends to exaggerate. I do not, Hank protested. Just add color. The young men eagerly joined them. Earl caught Jake's eye across the room, giving him a slight nod of inclusion. The boy finished wiping a table and joined them, sliding into the seat beside Earl with the ease of someone who had earned his place. As the night deepened, something subtle but significant was taking place, the passing of wisdom from one generation to the next. Not just tales of confrontation, but deeper lessons. About standing your ground without seeking conflict, about quiet dignity, about strength found in community rather than individual bravado. When closing time came, Earl stepped out with Chuck beside him. They stood under the vast canopy of stars, content in the knowledge that they had done what needed doing. See you Sunday? Earl asked. Chuck nodded. Fishing at the East Creek. I'll bring coffee. I'll bring Eleanor's cornbread. Earl replied, their ritual, established over years of friendship. As Chuck turned toward his truck, Earl called after him. Hey, Chuck? Chuck paused, looking back. Thank you, Earl said simply. Not just for what happened with Rex. For everything. Chuck held his gaze, then nodded, once a gesture that contained volumes between men who understood that the most important things often went unspoken. Earl watched his friend drive away, then turned toward home. The moon cast his shadow long across the parking lot, the silhouette of a man who stood tall, not because he had never been knocked down, but because he had always found the strength to get back up. As his headlights swept across his ranch gate, Earl felt a sense of peace settle over him. Not the fragile peace of absence of conflict, absence of trouble, but the deeper peace that comes from knowing exactly who you are and what you stand for. It was the peace of a man who had nothing left to prove and everything left to protect. Earl Thompson drove through the gate, toward the house that had sheltered 3 generations of his family. The porch light glowed in welcome, a beacon in the darkness, guiding him home. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.